Welcome to the Embodied Sounds podcast. My name is Joshua Sam Miller. I'm a musician, environmentalist, and entrepreneur focused on helping people connect back to the natural world through the arts. On this podcast, we'll be exploring specifically how sound can help you live a more healthy and balanced life. Please learn more at embodiedsounds.com. Welcome everyone back to the show. I'm your host, Joshua Sam Miller, and so pleased to have our guest today, Murray Hidary, coming in from Southern California. I've been a huge fan of his work, and I'm excited to get to learn more about a lot of exciting projects that he's working on. So welcome, Murray.
Thank you, Joshua. It's great to be here.
Could you tell me a bit about how you kind of got into music in the first place, and what was that kind of inspiration for you many years ago to sit down and play?
Yeah, well, I was fortunate enough to have a mom who really valued music, and my dad too, but my mom really pushed it. I think it's one of those stories where, as a child, she wanted to play music, especially the piano, and for whatever reason, my grandparents didn't get her lessons. So then when she had kids, I think she, kind of made up for that and gave all of us lessons when we were very, very young. I was 5 when I was introduced to music, along with, my brother and then subsequently my other brothers and sister years later. So it's something that I think our family just valued, my mom in particular, and made sure we had music in the house, in our lives. And it was an integral part to my growing up, not just playing music, but, we would go to concerts all the time. I grew up in Brooklyn, about, 30, 40 minutes from Manhattan. It felt like a continent away from civilization when I grew up here, of course. Now, of course, Brooklyn's like the coolest place to live, but back then it seemed like a million miles from anything. But we would go in, I would say maybe once a week or once every other week, we'd go in for, culture, like going to the symphony, going to concerts, going to museums. So it's something that, was really infused in my childhood. Classical music always on the radio station in the car as I was a kid. Music was really part of my life starting very young. The cello when I was 5, the piano when I was 6, and I grew up playing both of those, school orchestra, the whole thing. And I would say by the time I was in high school, I knew that I wanted to be a composer. I felt like I had my own thing to say with music. I was a pretty shy kid, had a vast internal world, as many kids do, but I didn't really have a way to vocalize or share it so easily. But music allowed me to do that in, just a very direct way. So I remember sitting at the piano in our home, for hours, all the time, and just kind of, figuring out, songs and patterns and melodies, and it was just a wonderful kind of world I can create for myself, at the piano.
What a great story. And I realized that you are probably calling in on this podcast from New York instead of Los Angeles. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm actually visiting my parents now for a few days. I had a big concert last night in New York City, on Broadway on 46th Street, and then I'm spending a couple of days just visiting my folks. So I'm actually in my original room that I grew up in. So it's kind of strange, but comforting all at the same time. And the piano I grew up in is literally downstairs. So I've been playing it, and it's terribly out of tune these days, but it's still fun and nostalgic to play. My room's a little different. They redid it after I moved out when I was 18, but it's still nice to have the same view of when I was a little kid.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so happy to be catching you in this state, because I know what that feels like. I've also been from New York and have traveled back many times over the years, and there's something special about always returning to where you grew up. So that's wonderful. And how was the concert last night?
Yeah, it's a partnership I created with Sony Hall, with Sony, and they they have this incredible technology that's like a 360 surround speaker system in the theater. It's about 30 speakers that surrounds the audience. And I created a new concept for MindTravel, which is not just playing the piano, but playing it with a soundtrack of nature that I engineered. And so when you're sitting in the theater, suddenly you hear thunder, from a distance, and the speaker system makes it seem like it's, 10 miles away and getting closer and closer. And so we really create a fantastical world of nature within this, theater. And then, of course, accompanying it, creating this soundtrack at the piano with the MindTravel music. So it's this wonderful collaboration. And the idea is to just take people into their imagination, deep into the sounds of nature, to connect with that deepest part of ourselves that is often overlooked, or not enough attention is placed on it when we're living in cities like New York. As great as these cities are, the proximity to nature is challenging, by definition. And most people in the world today, around the world, live in urban settings. So access to nature is, few and far between.
I 100% agree with that, and want to talk a lot more about MindTravel. Maybe you could give a little bit of a brief intro to it in case some of our listeners aren't already familiar, and then we can dive into a bit more of how that project got started, because there's a lot of overlap between us in that genre for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I jumped the gun a little bit on that timeline. But basically after I went to university actually for music. As I mentioned, I knew I wanted to be a composer and share my own voice, and studied to be a classical composer, pianist. And at around the same time, kind of late teenager years and in my 20s, I went on a deep journey to discover Eastern philosophy, Eastern meditation, traveled for a year, lived in Zen monasteries, kind of deeply immersed myself in that whole world, read everything I could get my hands on. And, one of the books that kind of set me off in that direction was the well-known book called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And, the kind of classic spiritual journey described in that book is something that spoke to me as, I was probably 18 or 19 when I read that. And it just really set me off on this path, which not many people around me, were taking. Today it's a lot more common, but back many years ago, it's something that, if you wanted to go down that path, you really had to, hack through the jungle of, of confusion on your own, mostly. So, but it was a wonderful journey, and music started to become more and more a part of that. In particular, when I studied the Japanese Zen tradition, it is infused with music as meditation. The Japanese flute, the bamboo flute called the shakuhachi, is actually, a flute that's deeply tethered to the Zen Buddhist tradition. The monks of the 18th, 19th centuries, they would roam the countryside playing this flute. And they would play a repertoire of pieces that were composed specifically for meditation, for this idea of moving meditation, right? In Japanese, we have zazen, kind of sitting meditation, and then we have suizen, this idea of moving meditation through movement, whether it's, say, a walking meditation or playing an instrument as meditation. And that really appealed to me, and I deeply studied that whole repertoire of music on the flute, and those sensibilities, even the gestures, started to work their way into my piano playing. And so this kind of East meets West, moment happened. And the ideas of Eastern philosophy, the music of Japanese Zen, all this started to conspire to kind of evolve my sound. And music for me became a pathway to deeper consciousness. Now, for many years, it didn't have a name. It was just my practice, just what I did. I would just play, on my own home, in my own space. And it's how I reset every day. It's how I just dealt with emotions. It's how I dealt with difficult times. It's how I just processed, creativity, imagination, and opening that portal of deeper consciousness through music. It's a very effective way to do it. And so that was just my personal practice for many years until I decided to bring it out to the world publicly. And once I decided to do that, I thought it should have a name for the experience. And so MindTravel was born at my dining room table, talking to a friend. So that's where it happened.
Okay, so I didn't realize that. So you actually had studied piano for a very long time, but were not performing in public until MindTravel came through. Wow.
That's right. Yeah, I graduated from university, so now I'm okay, great. Got this degree in classical composition, and I started to compose for other ensembles, string quartets, things like that, orchestras. But making a living at that is quite challenging as a 22-year-old. Just getting going. So I ended up actually throughout my 20s and early 30s, I was in the technology world. It was a time, kind of that mid 90s, late 90s, where the whole internet era was blowing up into this incredible just new industry of opportunity, and it was just so exciting. You kind of felt like you could do anything with this technology, and even though I wasn't a technologist, my older brother was, and two of us started talking and decided to just jump into it. We started our own company and figured it out along the way, and it was just a very exciting time to be part of it and to just see where it went. Kind of the equivalent today, right, would be what's happening in the whole blockchain world, in Web3 and crypto and all that. And it was kind of in a similar way, right? The early days of the web had that same kind of feeling of, lots of noise, lots of confusion, but lots of opportunity, and who knows what's going to happen, right? And that's what it was. So we built our company. We ended up doing several companies and taking the first one public and selling the second one. And so we had a really incredible time building really good companies with incredible teams. And even till today, 25 years later, there's such a culture of the people that work there. We were like all in our 20s and building our careers, and now everyone's lives have evolved, but there's still this wonderful connection that we all have, having worked together back in the early days. But I would play my piano every day, even during that time, and even in my office on Park Avenue in New York City, building my tech companies, I had a piano, and the staff would be every now and then be like, "Oh, where's Murray? We need to ask him something." "Oh, he's in his office playing the piano." So I always kind of maintain a connection with music through that time because it was so sacred to me, and it really wasn't about like, how am I going to make money with music? It was like, how is music as this pathway going to help me in the everyday, just manage emotional states and stress and all that. It made me feel good. And then more deeply, how is music going to help me open up kind of deeper states of consciousness? And I was keenly, interested in that and aware of that and exploring that, on my own, as my own practice. So those are the kind of the parallel worlds I was traversing through, and then it was years later I said, okay, look, I'd like to share this with the world. I've seen how powerful it can be. I've seen what it can do for me in a range, in a spectrum of areas. From dealing with very profoundly difficult life situations, intense grief, and also how it can help you connect with the joy of nature and the universe and the fabric of the cosmos herself. Like music is remarkably unique in that it can hold the space simultaneously for joy and pain. And I think it takes people a while, if ever, to really get how those two are truly two sides of the same coin. And, we are often, chasing pleasure or chasing things that feel good. But, oftentimes when things are externally driven, the fleeting nature of them is such that we're just in constant distraction trying to chase it again. All right. As opposed to really grounding and sourcing in joy internally. And that's a very different proposition. Now, at the same time, all things are fleeting and impermanent and ephemeral. And so baked into joy, when you're truly connected to joy, you also simultaneously feel the pain that it will dissolve. And in there lies the incredible beauty of life, and that's how I define beauty, is like this beautifully balanced complementarity of joy and pain. You look at a beautiful sunset and then in 5 minutes it's gone. So that's beauty, it's different than pretty. It's different than, it's true beauty lies in the knowing that it won't last. And it's magnificent in that sense. So, from there comes things like gratitude, and just to be able to witness what we witness and be part of what we're part of.
I love it. You're speaking to a lot of important topics of many different lineages and deep practices. So it's all very, very inspiring. I'm really curious to hear more about your creative process and what really composing is for you, as someone with many years experience. What would you say is running through you in your mind and your heart and your body when you sit down at the piano and start to compose something? What's a bit of your approach with that?
I think I have a few different approaches to that, just depending, but I think everything starts with a question, and then it becomes the quality of the questions we're asking that kind of determines the journey we end up on. So for me, a question I've always asked, and I continually ask, is, what does the universe sound like? Now, I don't mean that literally in a physics sense as we understand physics, because we know that, well, generally the universe is a vacuum if you just look at space. And of course, sound and vibration is a mechanical wave and requires a medium to travel through. So I'm clear that there's no quote unquote sound as we experience it here with an atmosphere, and the apparatus to interpret vibration as we do with our ears and the apparatus inside. But I'm talking about something, deeper than that, more hidden than that, kind of the hidden sound of the universe, right? So if we had a way to sonically translate all types of vibrations, not just sound waves or mechanical waves. So take electromagnetic waves, right? Which is what comes from the sun, right? Or X-rays or gamma rays, or all these vibrations that are, flying at the speed of light through the universe, right? Dating back to the cosmic background radiation, right? So you have all this activity happening, and you also have things like gravitational waves that are these massive, massive undulations of the fabric of space itself, right? They will typically come from the collision of two black holes or the collision of two neutron stars. I mean, it's just, the biggest of the big, right? The biggest stuff happening in the universe. And, two galaxies even colliding, which happens. And at the center of those galaxies typically is a black hole. What happens? What is the sound, quote unquote, right? What is the sound that takes place when two galaxies smash together and spiral together and become one, all right? Or neutron stars or whatever it is. So that to me is, and then it ripples out into these gravitational waves that travel literally billions and billions of light years, not miles, light years. It's like incredible. And here's the thing, they're in a certain frequency. Those undulations of space itself are in a certain frequency because they're vibration. The fabric of space itself is vibrating in a certain pitch, if we could interpret it that way. So that when the first gravitational wave was discovered some years ago by the apparatus we set up here on Earth, incredible new system called LIGO that we set up, it was actually in the key of C. Gravitational waves traveling in the key of C. So the universe is musical. That's the only way to interpret the whole universe, because the constant that we know is that everything is vibrational, period. Right? That is just a factual statement of all things. Different frequencies, some of them we can experience, some of them we can't. Some of them we can experience with our own apertures of awareness. Some of them we need measurement tools and devices. Some of them we can't even sense yet, right? We don't even know what dark matter and dark energy are. But trust me, they're going to be some type of vibration that's happening on a dimension that we can't fully access. But maybe one day we will, right? Let alone multi-dimensions, right? We exist in 3 physical space dimensions plus time, so 4 dimensions. But there's very well possibly other dimensions that we just have no access to, right? In the same way that a 2-dimensional being would have no idea, right, what 3 dimensions is. Like, you couldn't even conceptualize it, right? And you couldn't see it because you just couldn't see. You couldn't experience it. You wouldn't have the ability to even see it. Only things passing through 2 dimensions would be visible to you, but it would certainly seem very strange. So it's the same for us. There certainly could be some existence in higher dimensions that we just have no access to, and very well maybe possible. So again, it's like this hidden sound that just intrigues me, and I do my best to put a voice to that, a musical voice to that. I remember my dad coming to one of my first concerts years ago, and he's listened to me play since I was a kid, but typically classical pieces. So he comes to a first MindTravel concert, and afterwards I said, "Hey, Pop, what'd you think about it?" And he said, "Well, to be honest, I don't know. I didn't really get it. I don't know. And see, for him, music has always been something he can hum the tune of when he leaves the concert hall, right? Or put it on in his car, and then he's singing along, or he's humming it, or it's a tune that he can recognize. And you see, that's not something that interested me in the context of what I'm talking about here. Because it'd be the same as, take art, for instance. It's like, seeing a painting in a museum that's from the realist era versus an abstract painting, an abstract expressionist painting, or even impressionism, which kind of, rides the line between the two. You kind of know what it is, but it's certainly, not what it might look like, with our eyes unaided. So, there's an interpretation taking place. So for me, I'm using music to kind of break down the form of things, and what we might see as form with our eyes, right? To me, our ears hear that as, kind of, melodies that are kind of more strict in nature, how we're used to them. But when you break that down, you start to get to just kind of a sonic soundscape that's more vibrational and not going to be something that at the surface level we hear as, singable or hummable tunes. But by the 4th time he came, so I said to my dad, I said, just keep coming and just see what happens, see what opens up. And it was the 4th time he came where he comes over to me afterwards and he said, "Murray, I think I got it. I said, "Tell me what." He says, "You're playing the the soundtrack of creation. And
wow.
And I was just stunned. I was just stunned, and like I was deeply moved, emotionally moved, and to connect with my father on that was so powerful, because that truly is, I think, what's happening is at the core level, if all things are vibrational, right? That is the medium of causation, right, of everything. And so, yeah, I couldn't have summed it up better. So yeah, that's how I think of it from a cosmic point of view, and that of course then translates into our experience of consciousness, which is so hard to define, because any attempt at definition will completely miss the mark, because it's an experience. Anytime we try to use words to delineate or articulate an experience, it's going to be very, very challenging. We can try, and we might get close, but I think it's very, very tough. I mean, writers will say, when they can't think of the right words, they turn to the poet. But then the poet says, when they can't think of the right words, they turn to the musician. Because music picks up where words leave off. It's multidimensional. Words, we have to put one in front of the other to articulate anything. It's kind of like a melody putting a note in front of the other, but that limits us to a linear expression. But music has, right, of course, the notion of harmony. So it's operating both horizontally, one note after the other in a linear fashion, but it's also operating vertically, right? We stack, and that stacking has a harmony to it, or polyphony is a better word really for it. It's multiple voices at the same time, which in speaking world becomes noise. You can't understand. It's cacophony. It's a mess. But in music, I mean, that's the definition of it. It's, it's suddenly one voice plus another voice done the right way is communicating something that neither one of them is communicating on their own. How does that happen? Well, that's the miracle of music, So that's my main approach.
That's a beautiful story.
Yeah, so that's my main approach to sitting at the piano and music and composing, whether it's for the piano or for any ensemble. But then there's times when we're just going through stuff, and there it's like, how can I just be as present as I am with the instrument, and just allow my subconscious self, right? If we're talking about deeper states of consciousness, it's like we don't even know the full extent of what we're actually feeling. Like we really don't. Like we're aware of a very small percentage of what we're actually going through. And that's fine. It allows us to get through the day, because otherwise we'd, be overwhelmed with stimulus. But when we sit with music, and even if we're listening, the same thing's available. But for me playing, it's about how can I just get out of my own way and just allow the music to express itself however it wants to express itself. Which is why I improvise all the time, because if I just played a memorized piece each time, I think it would restrict me in some sense. So by just allowing the music to occur through my body, because so much of our emotion is housed in the body, right? We know we somatically will store trauma, we'll somatically store emotions that are not processed. So they're not just mental, right, images or thoughts, they're actual, energy in the body. So I need to give that some voice. And I just start with the first note and the second, and it starts to roll. And now we're on a journey down the river. And the river, of course, is the best metaphor for all this, because the river is never the same twice, though we call it the same river, as Heraclitus said. So you're sitting at the river, and it's always different, as we are always different. And we call ourselves the same names. Like, yeah, it's the Mississippi River is always the Mississippi River, but it's never the same Mississippi River, right? It's always Joshua, but it's never the same Joshua. So that's an important distinction to always keep in mind. And then to give that expression, I think is very powerful to do that. And that's how I do my best to stay in constant connection that way.
Amazing. I love both approaches, really, to this art form and the process of creation. And what does the universe sound like? What a more inspiring question to start from. So here's one that's coming up for me. Since you are back home where it all kind of started, do you think you said you went to NYU music school?
That's
Tisch
right.
school?
Yeah.
Do you think...
I went to arts and science, but not Tisch. I went to arts and science because I was studying theory and composition and all that.
Okay, thank you for the correction.
Yeah.
Do you think that version of yourself at that age, studying music, would ever think that you would be playing this kind of music now?
Well, actually, I was already playing this kind of music then because I was, as I mentioned, already on this Eastern philosophy journey, which started at around 16. I started to delve into that. And by the time I was in college, I was obsessed with the minimalist movement of music. And so you're talking about composers like Philip Glass, Steve Reich, Terry Riley. Now, it turns out that most of these guys who were pioneering this in the 70s, in the 80s, they're all Buddhists. Okay, they're all Buddhists. Philip Glass is Jewish, but he then, really took on Buddhism. Terry Riley, all these guys are deeply rooted in Eastern ideas, and yet their music is profoundly Western in a sense, but it embodies a lot of Eastern conceptualizations, looking for the essentialism in music, the organic nature of music, the pattern-based nature of music. All of this is in something like the minimalist movement. So I was very drawn to it. That sonic landscape was something that I felt very much like spoke to me, and I found a spirituality in it. So I not only listened to it, but played it and studied it. I was then lucky enough to meet Philip Glass because he lives right near NYU, and I bumped into him at a restaurant that I frequented at the time on West 4th Street. And I struck up a conversation with him. And as a very persistent 20-year-old, somehow convinced him to look at my work, my music, and everything I was working on in college, and would spend sessions in his townhome in downtown, and sitting in his studio, playing his piano, sitting in his kitchen, and talking about music and life and all of it. It was a very special time to have a mentor like that, someone I respected so much. And even now, I'll go to a concert, see him backstage, and he's in his 80s now, and it's just a wonderful connection over the decades that I've had. So to have someone, that kind of hears the universe in, okay, maybe not the same way, but maybe a similar way, right? And I think that's, as artists and as musicians, like what we're looking to do is like we hear the universe in a certain way. Like I know I do, I'm sure you do. And we want to share that because it's how we see ourselves. It's like this idea of being seen, being heard in life, and there's a profound nature to that. As human beings, it's so easy to feel isolated. It's so easy to feel alone. It's so easy to feel separated. And so what are the things that we do that are going to counter that and not distract from that, because that's the easy way, although not a sustainable way? Yeah, sure, we can drink, we can do drugs, we can watch TV, we can do all kinds of things and behaviors that for the moment, for that moment, make us feel unseparated. I don't even want to say connected because I think it's not true connection, but whatever. It makes us not feel alone for that moment. But then we go right back. So that's not the answer. That's not sustainable. So then there's something else available. And for me, music has been that pathway of like, I hear the universe a certain way, and in some way I think I believe in some way that if I play a certain kind of music, that the universe hears me back, and then I just don't feel alone anymore. And so if I can share that sound with others, then maybe they can feel that too, and maybe we can feel a connection between us through music. And that's truly how I meet most people these days, is at my concerts, at my musical experiences. And that's the first time I meet people, That's our first impression, as it were. And I meet people through music. And then, they might come over after and we have a conversation, but we met through music. And so there's a recognition, in the same way that I had a recognition with someone like Philip Glass, right? Who was 30 years older than me, and I listened to a recording, or then I played his music on the piano because I had the sheet music, and then I met him. But I already felt a connection in some way well before I met him. And so it's like that, there's a transcendent nature to it.
Absolutely. And I'm curious also if you ever collaborate with other musicians and feel that connection literally through music while you're playing, and what is that like? I know a lot of your work right now is solo, but when you do collaborate in an ensemble, what is it like to really sync up and be able to talk through the music?
I have quite a number of times, whether it's with a percussionist or a dancer even, or a violinist, or so I've done a bunch of things like that. I've also, of course, scored for orchestras, and that's just such a wonderful process to see all that come together. And I do love all that. I think though, for me, there's a freedom that I can't replicate outside of my collaboration just with the universe herself, where I have no encumbrances. When you play with other people, as much as, and of course, every musician will say this, like, yeah, there's such freedom, and we're, listening to each other, but there's only that freedom because there's so much constraint that's placed on it. Like, even in jazz, right? There's a tremendous amount of constraint in jazz that allows for the freedom that takes place within jazz. And that's great. And that's actually one of the ways I define freedom, is like the number of constraints that we create to then find the freedom within. But there's also something that is available to me when I just play alone, because I don't have to worry about keeping time. I don't have to worry about anything. And all I'm listening to is source at that point. I'm just listening, and whatever arises, and I don't know where it's going to go. Like, it just goes. So, yeah, it's not one's better or worse. It's just that's for me. That's just how it occurs for me. But there's such a freedom in it. There's just such a freedom in it. It's magnificent.
Amazing. Gosh, it's been so inspiring for me as a younger composer and musician to hear a bit of your personal process of creating. And I'm also curious to know, kind of on the other side with the MindTravel project, what is some of the response? What are some of the people who are attending these events telling you afterwards how they feel when they're able to connect in this way? Because I imagine it's a new experience for many people.
Absolutely. It's a new experience for many people. And, most people will show up. I ask them, how did you get here? How did you find your way here? Right. And for most people, it's through a friend, someone recommends it. And the friend would say, listen, I can't really describe it to you, but just trust me, just go or come with me. Or, I just had, someone last night was like, oh, my friend in LA told me to come to this in New York. She didn't really describe it, but she just told me to come. I was like, exactly. So now, there's a wonderful saying in Hebrew that says, that which comes from the heart enters the heart. And I think that's profoundly true in all areas of life, not just music. When we express ourselves from the heart, it has such an easier time to enter someone else's heart, right? So, music is the language of emotion. It's a unique language. And yes, we can use spoken language emotionally, but spoken language is an intellectual pursuit. It's left-brained. It's literally left-brained. So it's when we write, it's a left-brain activity. So music is comes from a different place. Like I said earlier, we discussed it's multidimensional, and emotions are multidimensional. No one ever feels one thing at one time. We might say that because we have such limited vocabulary around emotion. Like most people they don't even have the emotional literacy to describe things more than anger, sadness, like this, happiness. Like there's only a handful of emotions that people even have literacy around. But it's so vast and multidimensional. We're feeling many things at the same time. We came up with names for them, but the body doesn't know that they're called that. The body just knows that it's creating chemicals and it's moving stuff around and it's energy, and it's all a big knotted mess, and we have to parse it out and express it. But the body doesn't know the names we're calling it. It's just our attempt to decipher it and understand it better. But music can give expression to it, even if we don't know the names. It just allows us to allow it to rise up and out of us. So, when people come, they'll say they have profound feelings of healing, whatever it is they're going through. That's a big one for people. Doesn't have to be some profound grief. That was a deep way that I use the music in my own life, but it could be anything. It could be a relationship breakup. It could be just difficulty in a friendship. It could be trouble in business, finance. This way, it could be global issues. Could be just angst around, happenings around the world, which there's certainly a lot to be anxious about. So it helps with all that, and at the same time, people report a deep sense of connection, of universal love, something very profound. And the right kind of music really can engender that. It can open that space up.
I couldn't agree more. You mentioned you've been playing music since you were 5. I'm curious if you ever did take a break anywhere, and if so, for how long, and what was that experience like? What was that experience like to not have a regular music practice in your life?
Well, there was certainly some big chunks. Like, when I was 18, I left home after high school. I took a year and I traveled the world. I traveled the world on a bicycle. Thousands and thousands and thousands of miles on a bicycle by myself. Now, I did not take a piano with me. so I didn't have, any instrument with me at the time. But that's, that's not what that period was about. That period was about, learning at the, learning the world. It was about sitting at the chair of the universe and taking its lessons. It was defining. It was a coming of age, that was a profound year of discovery. And there were other pockets like that, months here and months there where I'd be on these adventures, in faraway places, usually. But then there was something else that was very compatible with music. For much of my 20s and 30s, I was very into, I guess you'd call them kind of adventure sports, or, things like that, like rock climbing or paragliding. I got my paragliding pilot's license. I would do river kayaking, all these kind of extreme sports, adventure sports. And it wasn't about the adrenaline rush. It wasn't about that. It really, although that felt great at times, but it wasn't really about that. It was about, how can I use these activities to create a deep intimacy with nature? Because that's what I realized, is like, what these sports are doing is they put you in a deep intimacy with different aspects of nature. So rock climbing, for instance, you're literally an inch from the rock. Like, you're on the rock, and your eyes are like 1 inch from the rock. You will never be more intimate with a mountain than rock climbing or mountain climbing. And you're, every crevice, every little tiny handhold and foothold, you're talking about centimeters at times, like centimeters. That makes all the difference. And it's just not something you're going to grasp an appreciation of like a mile away in the valley, as beautiful as the mountain is, right? It's just a different intimacy. It's like seeing someone afar and you're like, oh, they look like an amazing person. And then that versus being in a relationship with them for 10 years and knowing every nook and cranny of their personality, right? It's like, that's what I was after. Same thing with paragliding. Yeah, I can look at the sky and the clouds and I could look at eagles and falcons taking thermals up and flying with the winds, and it's wonderful and it's magical and it's wonder. But then there's something different than being up there yourself, flying without power, without a motor, and taking the currents up and down and being a bird in that way and flying literally through clouds. And I mean, there's a different intimacy with the sky. Same thing with water. You can look at a river, you can be in a big boat. Yeah, wonderful. But when you're in a kayak at the height, at the level of the water, in the water, and you're reading every current and every shifting pattern and every rock in the river, and I mean, it's a different level of intimacy. And so you get to know the river and you get to know water. So I did that with, most of kind of what we call the elements, with earth and wind and water. I try to stay away from fire. Don't play with fire. Although I do love fire, but that's why I go to Burning Man, to get close to fire, I guess. But yeah, that's so time away from music, yeah, sure. But I would sit, at the base of a rock with a creek running in it, sometimes for half an hour on a hike. I would just stop hiking and sit by a boulder with a creek and just listen to the music of the creek. Well, that's musical. That is music. So, it's like you don't have to play an instrument to be a musician, It's like you just have to know how to listen. And I know a lot of musicians who don't know how to listen, and it shows in their music. So I think that, it's about just being a human being that can truly listen. It's probably the greatest skill we can hone, we can develop. Like any of us, all of us.
I love that you mentioned this about listening. I always like to ask guests on this show if you are a musician and if you do have this musical practice that has helped build up a sense of listening, being that, sound is the first sense we develop in the womb and the last we lose when we die. Have you noticed your ability to listen in music transfer to other parts of your life, both personally and in relationships or in business, perhaps, that have helped you in any way to develop that practice of deep listening?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Sound is that first sense that's developed in the womb, and even in everyday life, as we move through life, sound is the sense that doesn't ever turn off. We have eyelids, but we don't have earlids, right? Like, we just can't turn off our ears. And from an evolutionary and survival standpoint, that's actually been very important. Like when we're sleeping, we can hear, a predator coming, right? If you were living, thousands of years ago, right? And so that's usually how we might wake up, is through some sound or something like that. So, the ears are always this open space of taking in vibration and listening to the landscape. So then it becomes a question of the quality of our listening. And as you mentioned, kind of this deep listening. And, I think the greatest gift that anyone can give is their attention. So that's an important distinction between attention and just listening. Because I can listen to what you're saying, and in the meantime, I might be thinking of what I'm going to say next, right? Well, is that really listening? And that's how most people have conversations. Like, they think they're actually listening to the person, and in the meantime, they're formulating their next, rebuttal, question, statement, counter argument, whatever it is. Whatever, that is what it is. But it's not an openness of listening that will create something new. So if we're interested in evolving, in growing, then we have to have an openness to then improvise in the moment, to dance in that moment, in that communication connection. And that's what it is. Like, communication is a intentional space that we create. If we're both reciting kind of pre-formulated lines, well, then we're actors in a script, right? But that's how most people kind of communicate, even if they don't, quote unquote, have a memorized line. I'm exaggerating, but they do have memorized lines, and that's their stories of life, right? I mean, that's like, everyone tells the same stories all the time, in just different kind of formulations. So to get past the story, the narrative, the complaint, the offense, like all of that, means you have to listen in a new way, a way that's open, that has a sense of possibility to it, just like the way we play, just like the way you play the piano. If I keep listening the same way, I'm going to play the same thing over and over again. It's like, how do I find something new pathway? Mm-hmm. But that's so that truly is the distinction between listening and attention is I'm really giving you my attention. I'm not somewhere else. I'm not either distracted by what's around, or I'm not distracted by my past. You see, if I'm just listening from my past, then I'm not present with you. If I have a history with you where, we've had friction, we've had certain arguments, and every time I'm with you, all I do is I see you as that person that I've had friction with. Could be at work, could be a friend, could be a relative. Like, we all have people like that in our lives. And when you sit with them, there might even be an elevation of like cortisol. You might get stressed, your heartbeat might raise. Like we might have a physical reaction, right? A somatic reaction to actually being with that person. Even the notion of knowing you're going to see them, it's in your calendar, you might have elevated levels, right? So, and this has been proven, like, you can actually measure this. So, okay, so now that you're with them, what's happening is you're clearly anticipating, your body's in an anticipatory state, and you're trying to manage the stress of what might come. And so you're totally living in the past with that person, right? Like they're just occurring for you as the past. Understandably so. But very difficult to transcend that dynamic because you're just going to react and interact with them as their past self, as opposed to a possible self, or to help create them as something new. It's just a very different dynamic, but it requires our attention being here and not in the past. So it's a different way to think about attention, because usually we think about attention as like, oh, my phone's distracting me and I'm here and I'm, like doing other things or thinking about other projects. No, you can literally be paying attention to them in your mind, but really you're thinking of them as the past. And in that way, you are not attentive. So the greatest gift we can give someone is our full and complete and open attention. And that is the deepest listening I know of.
Wow. What an amazing answer. I'm so happy we went here in this conversation. And what you're describing is one of the reasons why I don't like to write questions for these interviews, because I don't want to have the next thought in my mind when I'm talking with you. I really do like being present.
Well, you get every now and then you get a guest like me that can ramble on for half an hour.
That's great. I really like what you have to share, and I think it's helpful to a lot of people who are maybe stuck in the past or struggling to understand what presence can offer. Is there anything maybe you want to ask me or that you feel inspired to share?
No, listen, I think it's great to give voice, to give some articulation to these ideas. Again, we have to experience it. We can talk about listening and attention all we want, but the moment you actually are with someone and fully present with them, it just feels totally different. And you got to feel it to get it. You got to feel it to get it. Just like music. You can't, imagine talking about music and never listening to music. Like, it would be impossible. And I think it's the same way. A lot of these ways of living, these experiences of the human condition, have to be experienced, which is the bittersweetness of wisdom. Like we can share as much wisdom as we want, or we can listen to as much wisdom from someone else that we admire. But we have to go through the lessons ourselves ultimately, because those are words, and wisdom only comes from experience. It just does. So, that's like the eternal plight of the parent. Like every generation, the parent will fail, and in so will succeed. But that's never going to change, because the teenager, which I was one, and you were one, and everyone was one, will always want to strike out and figure it out for themselves, and will fumble, and they're supposed to. And the parents will feel bad and like, oh, I didn't do my job. No, but it's all built into the game. It's all built into the game.
Do you have kids?
I don't even have kids, and I get that. so I have lots of nephews and nieces, but and I'm sure when I have kids, I'll learn some other lesson, or I'll listen to this and I'll be like, oh my God, it's really this, or that. So
yeah.
But as far as I can assess by having been a kid, and that's one thing, we all have that experience, right?
Definitely. And I asked you before, would your younger self think you'd be playing this style of music now?
Yeah.
And you said yes, because you were already into it. I asked that because I feel a lot of our listeners might be somewhat new to listening to music from this genre or perspective and with this type of intention. So perhaps there could be some resistance to give it a try. What maybe advice or guidance might you have for someone who's, maybe going through something or stumbling into this genre or this world of listening for the first time and wants to have a good experience?
Yeah, in Eastern traditions, right, they have this great saying, which is, when the student's ready, the teacher will appear, right? Um, I always wondered, when I was younger, I was like, what does that mean? And you truly have to be ready for the teaching, for the teacher to actually, show up. And because you probably will have met the teacher many times, and the teacher, you didn't even recognize the teacher because you weren't ready. And I think it's the same with this kind of music. It's like you have to be ready for it. It doesn't mean you have to consciously be ready for it. But you just have to be ready for it on some level. And I guess the only thing I would say is that, look, there's an openness that if you're able to maintain an openness and not be tempted by categorization, because that's how the brain works. The brain likes to categorize things. So the moment you see something, hear something, meet someone, anything, the brain's trying to put it in a box and be like, oh, it's like this, right? Pattern-based. So you hear music, you're like, oh, it's kind of like this that I've heard and that I've heard. But see, none of that's necessary. None of that's necessary. You don't have to make sense of it. You just have to be open and just see what occurs. See what rises up. See how you feel. And maybe it's not for you. Maybe it's not. And then what's great is after the music's over, you can forget about it. There's very little downside, The only commitment is to the time you're listening, and that's it. So there's a nice risk-reward ratio to music, more so than other art. Like if someone tells you to read a book, that's actually a long time commitment. That takes hours and hours and hours, days sometimes to read a book, and then you're like, oh, that book was crap, And then you're like, oh, I spent a lot of time on that. But music doesn't take much time. It happens in real time, so it's just the time you spend. So at most it'll be minutes or an hour, So
it's a low stakes, maybe.
It's relatively low stakes for a tremendous upside. Yeah, yes. It's a good ratio. It's a good ROI.
I like that angle. I never thought about it that way, but that's true.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever said that either, but it's a good ROI.
That's funny. Well, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish up today?
No, I thought it was a compelling conversation, and thank you for your listening. And you've clearly, mastered the art of listening. So it's great. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you as well, and I'm excited for, maybe some collaboration one day. Let's do something.
Absolutely, and we've kicked off the beach concerts again last week, and we just get such a great community coming out for those events over the years, and please come join us for that.
Thank you. Actually, one final question before we do close is, where can people learn about what it is you're doing? That's always an important one.
Yeah, absolutely. So easiest is MindTravel.com. And on social, it's at Murray Hidary, MurrayHidary. It's just my name, at Murray Hidary on Instagram. Mainly Instagram. We post a lot of stuff there.
Amazing. We'll post all that in the show notes. And thank you, everyone, for listening. This was a conversation with Murray Hidary, pianist, composer, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and meditation expert. So thank you for your time, and please check out our website at embodiedsounds.com for more episodes with people working with sound to improve their life.